Hello everyone and welcome to the Victoria Game Engine series. This is episode 6 and today we are going to be covering events. So an event is this object that we have in our code that when something triggers it, it calls to a bunch of other functions that are registered to it to also happen or to have themselves be called and have certain events, have certain things that need to happen occur. The easiest way to illustrate this, for instance, is say in our code say we're making a game, because this is what it is, it's a game engine, and we have when an object collides with the loading zone, we need something to happen. So for instance, we might have two functions there. One of them goes and returns or calculates the next room that we need to load and sets that up in memory so that the next room is going to be loaded, and the other one needs to calculate what object it is, so what room, whether we need to load the room at all, because say the object might be a player, it might be player 2 if it's a multiplayer game, for instance, it might need to load those rooms separately for different players. So that's kind of the point of an event class, and it won't see as much use in the earlier stages of the project. But as we get later and later into the series, we will start to see uses later on. And especially when it comes to games, when we eventually get that set up to be able to be ran, there will be a lot of things that we are able to do there. Of course, there is a little bit of housekeeping that we need to do first off. So the very first thing we need to do is we actually need to go to our error types, because we are going to be getting some very fancy new error messages. And these messages are as follows. So the first one we have is error can't find. And the next one is error can't create. And there's one more I've almost forgotten, and that is error help. So most of these are fairly self-explanatory. Error can't find will be called whenever we need to find, whenever we cannot get something. So say we have our string class at some point, which we will be creating, and we need to find a certain character in the string. So if that string can't find the character, then we can return error can't find. Or for other cases where we're not specifically needing an error value, we can return error can't create if there's something within a system that we cannot physically create an object of. So this will be very useful when it comes to OpenGL context creation. So error help isn't necessarily an error in of itself, but it is a way for an error function to back out whenever what is actually returned isn't the intended result, but what we want to return from that given function isn't also an error at the same time. So it's kind of, the other thing I'm going to do here is just a little bit of cleanup. I'm going to make sure that we have the error types there, and this is just to have some code formatting consistency with more updated versions of the engine that I have elsewhere. And within here, within our error types, we also have to add the string versions of these, because again, this assertion here is making sure that that is the case. So under item was null, we have item cannot be found, and item cannot be created. And we have help was called for. And we'll add a comma there to make sure that when we add more to this error message, we can go ahead and do so. And with that out of the way, we're pretty much ready to jump straight into the actual event class itself. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be going to data and we're going to be right clicking. I'm going to say new file and we're going to call it event.h, because it is going to be much like our vector class. It's going to be a header only file because we're going to be using templates. And of course the if and def event.h, which we'll just copy and define here. We'll end if here. And we'll of course need our include, so that will of course be our age-old core typedefs.h. We'll also want core-error macros.h. And we're also going to want our vector class. Now, Later on, we may want to look at replacing some parts of our code with different things when we get more data types. But for now, I'm going to be relying on vectors in this specific instance here. And that specific instance is going to be our entire event class. So here it is in most of its glory. So as you'll see here, it's a very basic structure. There isn't much to this class in of itself. We have our template declaration. We're using ... here for our arguments because we want a variadic number of arguments. And what that means, if you remember that from the logger video, that a variadic number of arguments means that you can have 0 extra arguments, you can have 10 extra arguments, you can have any number, an indeterminate number of arguments within your class, and it should be able to function as you would expect. This existed in C, of course, and it does exist in templates for C++, which means that we can add some arguments to our class constructors. So as you'll see here, we have a type-defined void pointer listener. So this is a function pointer. For those of you who do not know what a function pointer is, effectively it acts effectively the same as a regular pointer, except that rather than pointing to the first index or the first point of an array in memory, it instead points to the address of a function within the executable or DLL file itself. And from there, we have args ... listed here. This just means that whenever we construct a class of type element, that when the class is being constructed in the compiler, it will fill out the arguments that we have specified within here for it. So in another private declaration, we also have our vector of listeners. Again, this is quite literally just how we hold all of our individual listeners. Really, this should be something like a linked list or just a list in general. But a vector works just fine as well because we're only trying to just hold the addresses of data types. We could even go slightly more basic and just use a pointer of function pointers, so an array of function pointers without creating a vector class in of itself. But for the sake of this video, and for the sake of simplicity of the class, we are going to be using vectors because the functionality already exists in our systems, and therefore there's very little point trying to create an extra system. Then we actually have the functions that we use with this class. So we have a connect function, we have a fire function, and we have a disconnect function. And you will see what those classes do in a moment. And we also have our constructor and destructor, and they don't do anything. Literally just before recording this video, I did have an idea of something that I could do with class construction, specifically for around creating a more viable method of constructing the class so that you don't have to manually register, so many events. You can just construct the class with an event already assigned, but I will leave that for a later video. With that said and done, we now actually get on to the actual functions themselves. So the first one in our list of functions is our connect function. I've also added a bunch of documentation for these, so you should be able to read through and understand what these functions do. Of course, if you have any concerns or just things that you think the documentation is bad at doing, please do let me know, because I've probably missed things or made things sound bad, and there's inconsistencies. I know there's inconsistencies with the way I do my documentation, so any comments on that, please do let me know. But yeah, all this does is it takes the address, so the function pointer that we have given, and sets the priority here. But yeah, so you will have this bool priority, and this just says if the event you want to push to the front or to the back of the queue. So if there's a lot of events that you've just registered, and you want this event to happen first because you've realized that the order at which they register with the event type or the event object is in an order where you cannot make this specific event register earlier, you will then want to say to push to the front of the queue, specifically just so that every other event can fire as is. And that's quite literally all it does. There's not much else it can do, at least not with the current setup. It's, again, very basic because of all the extra work that the vector class does here. The vector class is pulling a lot of its own weight. So next up, we then have the fire function. All this does is it just gets the size of the number of listeners that we have registered. If there aren't any, then we return there's no point calling listeners that don't exist. And for every listener, we call to it at I and all of the arguments. With this function specifically, you'll see that it specifies args, p-args here. And in this form here, it will just expand out how many arguments are specified here into this. If there are no arguments specified, then it will just fire as normal, and I'll show demonstrations of this at the end. Anyway, last function up is the disconnect function. And again, all this will do is it will simply go through the entire event class and try to find the specific listener that you've specified, and if it can't find that listener, then it will return that it couldn't find it, and otherwise it will just remove it and say all was good. And that's quite literally the entire class done. There's not a lot to it. I expressed in the previous video how I was quite happy with this class. It's very light. It doesn't do much in terms of being complicated. You can kind of just get what's going on because it again uses vectors. But now we will go into main and we are going to write some tests just to show that all of our all the stuff that we've written so far is in fact working. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go and include it because of course you need to have the class itself. And we're going to write a couple of test functions. So we're going to have test func1. This is going to have a type of int arg, and all it's going to do is it's going to print debug, and we're also going to have the same thing happen here with test func2, and this is going to print it normally. And that's just it for the test so far. We'll just do 2 functions, nothing too serious. Now we're going to create our event class. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to do event and use the greater than, less than symbols to capture the int. I'm going to call this ev. I'm going to ev, we're going to connect the test func1. Here, you don't need to specify the parenthesis for the actual function itself, because you just want the function's, basically its memory address, which is what the first part tells you, and the second part just calls it. And the connection here, test func2, also false. We won't be testing that out here, but there may be cases. If you want to mess about with swapping this to true and seeing what happens and how events fire, feel free. If you want to write a bunch of other test functions that do a bunch of things, feel free to do that as well, and just you can mess around with these. Now, it's all well said and done trying to register the events, but what we do want to do is we do want to fire it, and we're going to give it the number 42 because we are very creative here. And if you were responsible, you'd also disconnect your test functions. Do that as well. You don't necessarily need to do this. When the array is destructed, it will just free the memory and get rid of the function pointer anyway, because it calls that rather than having to do that. But it's also But it's also a good idea to clean your own code up just so that you know what's going on. But you don't necessarily have to do this. It'll be done for you automatically, I should say. But with that said and done, you can now just hit Control-Shift-B to build your project. And of course, if you followed episode 5.1, you will now be all up to date with Make. And because I pre-compile the code, you'll just see that here main only May compiles. But for you, you should also get error types and error macros, as well as main to compile. We can now press F5 to run, and you should see that both these functions are called. And as you can see there, in file main cpp, function test.1, line 9, the number was 42. This fired second, and the number was 42. So as we can see there, our event system is working. And that is quite literally this entire class done. Thank you very much for watching this video. I am so sorry this took forever and a day to put out. I know that running on a once-a-month schedule is not what I said, but specifically on this video, I had a couple things come up, and I had to re-record this video. I think this is my third attempt at re-recording the entire video, not including editing. So it's been pretty tricky getting it out. I can't lie, I've been fairly perfectionist about these videos, even if they may not seem that way. But again, hopefully slightly more regular next week, but I can't hold myself to any promises at the moment. So again, thank you very much. I hope you will be back in the next video, where we will begin to look at the OS class. Yes, we will be looking at the OS class, and this is actually the basis for the scaffolding to begin the process of actually making a triangle. We may well make it to a triangle by episode 10. I can't be certain, but we might. So again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.